Everyone. Welcome to Leading Through Crisis, Emotional Intelligence in Action. And during our time together, we'll be covering these objectives of understanding how emotionally intelligent practices can support workplace well-being and health outcomes during crisis situations. We'll talk about how you can recognize and manage compassion fatigue and emotional labor when dealing with a crisis. And we're going to learn practical strategies to consider before, during, and after a crisis.
So, setting the stage for handling a crisis, what is emotionally intelligent leadership and what does it look like? Well, think about it. When school leaders are emotionally intelligent, when they're attuned to their own emotions and to the emotions of others, and when they're skillful at regulating with their own emotions and co-regulating with others, they create communities where people feel safe, where people feel psychologically safe, and people feel that their leader cares. In those kinds of communities, they're protected from the devastating impact, at least to some degree, of negative and toxic stress. In times of stress or during a crisis, emotionally intelligent leaders can nourish their staff so that people feel greater job satisfaction. People feel like they can work to their fullest potential. People have lower turnover intentions and overall better mental health and habits of well-being, like better sleep quality, if you can possibly get some sleep during those times. So if we want emotionally intelligent leaders in our schools, because this is the impact they're having on their school community, how do we get to be an emotionally intelligent leader? Well, of course, we all know the answer to that because everyone here is a ruler school. So we use the principles and tools and skills of ruler. And particularly in crisis, all emotions matter. Going to have a range of emotions, and as you'll hear from Fran and from yourselves in the chat room in short order, emotions really matter during crisis, as they do every single day. But particularly at that time, we may need to pay attention to the emotions of our school community as we forego the math lesson for another check-in, as we reorient our faculty and students to include a moment of meditation in the morning, which might not be our typical routine, but suddenly it's there and necessary. We know that emotions are social, and as you are feeling, you're impacting other people, and people around you are impacting you, and all of them are impacting each other. During a crisis, it's really important to be mindful of what you're putting out there. It's really important to be mindful of what you're letting in and using the skills of recognizing and regulating will be very important during that time. Recognizing what you're feeling and recognizing when you have feelings that are very different or more intense than at other times for you. During the pandemic, for example, people were reporting levels of anxiety that they had never experienced before, and were really having trouble regulating them in their typical way. So it was an opportunity for many people to identify and start to use new regulation strategies. And the same thing goes for leaders who are recognizing emotions in others, tuning in with empathy, tuning in with compassion, going that extra mile to listen more fully, recognize what somebody has an individual need. Maybe they do need a day off. Maybe they need to be excused from a class. And maybe co-regulating doesn't just look like helping people to calm down, using your emotions to move people to gather themselves, but rather at times regulating can look like helping people lift up. When people are exhausted, people are stressed out, you might need to help them lift in your co-regulating efforts. So being skillful in that way. Remember, we can always develop these skills at any time. And the tools of emotional intelligence, the tools of ruler, critical to revisit during this time outside of the immediacy of the crisis moment. There may be words on the charter that are left out for people. Maybe suddenly it's really important to feel like everyone feels understood if there's been a death due to suicide. Maybe it's really important if there's been a school shooting for people to feel safe and to see that on their charter and to practice safekeeping in their school community. Using the mood meter during a crisis, during traumatic moments, during everyday crises and upsets. Checking in with your feelings. Notice what are your go-to strategies and are they working? What are the patterns that are showing up? And how does that help you to adjust who you're having lunch with on a Monday? And being your best self, using the meta moment to prolong that space and time from when you're triggered to when you respond. And maybe you're triggered just when you're getting up in the morning and you know you have to go to school and you have to face what's going on, even though you might not want to. Your best self is the you most want to be and the you want other people to see. And during a crisis, getting up and stepping into every interaction with your best self may take a lot of effort, but it's really important because people are watching you. And if you're making the effort to be your best self and modeling that for your staff, for your students in the building, it will have a big payoff. And the blueprint, during the times of crisis, there are going to be very big feelings, bigger than many people have ever experienced. And people may feel more out of control, leading to more conflict. So using the blueprint to help people be in an empathic position with each other and with themselves, to take perspective, and to help the community rebalance and reset after a conflict has been disruptive in a classroom. And those are just some of the ways to use the principles and the skills and the tools that you're all familiar with. And before we move forward with Fran telling his story a little bit, I don't know how much you're going to go into it, Fran, but I hope you will tell your story. And Fran will also walk us through a case study. A word of caution. It's likely, as you listen to Fran's story or to the case study he's going to present to us, that emotions will come up. And we invite you to welcome your emotions. We invite you to experience them. We want you to be mindful of how you're holding them, though. Some of you may want to sit with them, hold them lightly, and others want to take a step back. We want you to engage with this space in the way that you're most comfortable. So if you'd like to feel your feelings and stay with it, please feel free. If you feel like you need to take a step away or even turn off your camera and turn off your sound for a moment or for a few moments, we'll let you know in the chat room when we're resuming with the webinar after Fran's stories. We want you to be comfortable and we want you to have takeaways from the stories if you're listening. So hang in there or hang back. And now I'll turn it over to you, Fran.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you for that overview of the ruler skills and principles and approach. And again, while we're thinking through managing through crisis, a lot of the work that's important is the proactive work. So going through this case study, while challenging to consider, being in this type of situation, when we can go through scenarios ahead of time, it helps you plan and prepare. In my career as a teacher and a school leader and a principal, I've had a lot of different situations I've dealt with. And as a principal, most recently, I faced one of the most challenging experiences I could ever imagine. We lost 2 students to suicide within a couple of months of each other. It was a devastating time for our school community, our students, staff, families, myself. We were all just grappling with intense grief. At this time, my own emotional intelligence skills and my understanding of how emotions impact everything really became the cornerstone of how I was able to support myself, but really support my school through not just the initial crisis management piece, but also the long and complex process of healing that followed. This situation wasn't my first encounter with tragedy in school. And as a school leader, earlier in my career, I was in an administrative position in a different district, in a different school where we experienced the loss of a student as well. When I think back to that experience, it was clear just how much harder or more of a challenge it was at that time for myself to be able to be an effective leader and everyone else involved, because we really lacked the skills and tools to navigate the intense emotions that come with such a crisis. We didn't really have any framework or understanding of how emotions were driving the behavior of all of us. We didn't have any shared language to communicate how we felt, and the varying levels of ability to process what we were experiencing in our own ways. So if you fast forward back to my most recent experience as a principal, when these tragedies struck, it was terrible and awful, but our school had a solid foundation in proactive work in social and emotional learning. And we had been working on developing our emotional intelligence skills as adults in order to support teaching and learning. And what we realized is it was not only supporting teaching and learning, it was supporting us as an entire community. So my staff had spent the entire previous year, along with myself, immersed in the emotions matter mindset, applying the principles and tools of emotional intelligence with the adult focus. After the initial crisis, many of my staff shared with me just how critical the learning of these skills and applying them to themselves were to prepare them for this difficult time we were facing. Nothing could erase the pain of those losses. In fact, they're still with us. But our adult focus on SEL and emotional intelligence really equipped us with tools to manage our emotions so we could support each other and stay grounded as educators, colleagues, and friends. The tools didn't fix the situation, but they provided us with this framework for resilience. They gave us the language to express our grief and the strategies to navigate moments when it just felt overwhelming. They allowed us to hold space for our students' pain while managing our own, and they reinforced the importance of leading with empathy and emotional intelligence during a crisis. So those experiences, which have changed me as a person, as a dad, and as a leader, they also led to growth. And I'm hopeful to continue to share some of my experience with you as we go through this case study. So what I want you to do right now is imagine yourself as a school principal. Put yourself right there. It's Monday morning, you're in your office preparing for the week, and the day ahead on your Monday morning, and your phone rings. And on the other end is an officer from the local police department. With a somber tone, the officer informs you that Vanessa, a well-known junior at your school, who was active in student leadership and sports, was tragically killed in a car accident late the night before. This news is devastating, and you feel a sudden wave of grief and disbelief. The officer explains that Vanessa's family has already been notified, and you are the first person at the school to receive the news. So putting yourself in this scenario as the principal, how do you feel hearing this news? Please share in the chat your thoughts and feelings that come up in this situation with you as the principal. So Robin, I can see you sharing. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Disbelief, sadness, devastation, heartbroken, uncomfortable, stunned, overwhelmed, sad. Thank you everyone for sharing. Worried. One emotion would be pressure. Disheartened, deeply saddened. So a lot of blue emotions, some red emotions as well.
Yeah, and Robin, I can see also that's an important note. Someone shared that they felt pressure as the leader, which is such an important point. So you're feeling all these deep blue emotions and also feeling that pressure as a leader of the school.
Thank you for calling that out, Fran.
Yeah.
wondering how we can come together to support our community. Yes, thank you, Anna.
So with all of those intense emotions that you're feeling, and you are immediately understanding the weight of this situation, obviously by how you're communicating that to us right now, you also need to act quickly. You need to act quickly to ensure that the school is prepared to support students and staff while also communicating this tragedy in a compassionate and responsible way. So how do you respond? So you start to think about how are you going to manage this situation with care? And what things do you need to think about and have in place in order to manage that? So a lot of what I would fall back onto in this situation is what was our prior planning? What prior planning did we have in place, which is so important when you're, to keep you on track with what to do and what your next steps are and the things you need to consider. So with all that going on, how will you manage your own emotions in order to do that as the leader? So what are some thoughts? What are some strategies you may lean on?
Remembering to take time for self-care later on. Yes.
Yes, and Robin, and that'll be in a few slides from now. We'll talk about that, the later on steps. But so many of these strategies that you're identifying here are going to be so helpful in this moment of hearing this news, the space between hearing the news and getting to the action, planning for what you're going to do to respond. So, you're in your office, you get the news, you get that all these overwhelming deep blue emotions that you're feeling along with the pressure of how to respond. You access some of those strategies that help you get yourself on track here. And then comes the action. What do we do next? So, you have to start thinking about what communications, what supports, what teams you have in place in school already to help you handle the situation. A lot of this work looking at like the proactive before the crisis planning that you can then lean on in this moment. So, ideally, if you had planning prior, you can then lean on it. So, the recommendation of having a crisis response team in place, made up of key personnel, administrators, mental health team, maybe facilities, a school resource officer, or any other key personnel that you can think of. So if that team is in place already, the next step is to assemble that team, get that team together, have some clear protocols of how to get that team together. Will it be in person or will you have to do it virtually, depending on when the news is coming to you? And understanding who's leading up that team. And then the things that the team needs to accomplish together is a plan of communication. Number one, how are we going to notify, what's appropriate to notify staff, students, and community? How and what can we say and share? In this type of situation with the loss of a student, it's important that you're able to establish, a person that's connected to the family. Who's that liaison of communication going to be with the family? And what member of the family are you going to be able to communicate with? Really keeping in mind the privacy and respectful nature of how, along with your responsibilities as a school and district leader, with how to, navigate the communication of this. That's why it's so important to have that crisis team in place prior. So then when you call them together, you can go through these things. And what resources do you have planned in advance, from resources you can share with families and teachers and students, to communication templates, like example templates of how you will communicate difficult news like this. So if having that stuff ahead of time is helpful when you're navigating the crisis in the moment with all these really intense emotions going on. And you start to think about, in the moment, what are the logistics? So who do we communicate this to? District and school staff, students, families, Board of Education. What are your responsibilities and your obligations? And how will you do it? So as I said, you're considering the student's family, and also considering the best way to do it. So in this scenario, it's the morning and it's a school day and you have staff coming in. recommendation I would have that would probably come through your crisis team too is gathering all staff in one space ahead of time so you can have a clear single communication to them. Because at the same time, we know in the world we live in now, we're trying to get out ahead of the rumors and how social media can send a message that maybe isn't true and is hurtful to the situation. And then what supports can you put into place immediately for students and your staff? Where will they be? And how do people access them? So if you have counselors available, where are they going to be and how do students access them, or how does staff access them? Where in the schools will it be? If this news comes on a weekend or maybe a holiday break, how do you communicate the support you have in place for students, staff, and family, and how people can access them too as well? So it's important to have an idea ahead of time of how that will be, but then really working with a strong team to put those things into action. And then considering your follow-up after. So after the immediate crisis response, working with your staff, supporting students, how are you following up later in the day with your team? What went well? What do we need more of in the coming days of school? What other supports are we going to need? What mental health professionals can we consult with? Does your state Department of Education provide supports and resources in these types of situations? Is there a local RESC educational alliance that can help you with it as well? Or maybe a neighboring town can offer support of their mental health professionals in a difficult time like this. All things to consider when you're planning and then responding to a crisis.
Fran, I have a question, and I'm wondering if other people have this question also.
Yep.
How long and who actually created all this material for you in your school?
Well, we had, I was very grateful that we had a crisis response team in place, and annually we reviewed the team members, and we had an annual meeting to sit down with the team to review process and protocols and make changes that were necessary. Because like in my districts and any other district, there's turnover and there's changes and different people, and this was our most important committee and team. And we relied on our crisis response team in many different ways, from a really big, huge community impact type crisis like this scenario we're going over here, to smaller scenarios where maybe it was a death of a student's parent that was a crisis and was going to impact part of our community. We would get the crisis response team together to work through that situation to make sure it wasn't just me making a decision. I had the appropriate staff to collaborate with in that.
So, Fran, what were the emotion regulation strategies that you use when you look at this list?
Yeah, in this list I love. These are just great go-to strategies that we as educators can use on a daily basis. In this scenario, in this type of situation, there were two that really stood out to me that, we continue to use. And number one was permission to feel. And the importance of granting that permission to feel for both myself and for others, and then social support. Those were the two go-to strategies that we had to continue to go back to during this crisis management.
Can we talk about each one then?
Yeah, sure.
Will you share with others, with everyone listening, what did you do in order to give yourself permission to feel, and when did you do it?
So this was tough. It's interesting. I was talking to a colleague today as I was explaining our webinar that we were doing today, and it was a colleague I was very close with during this time. And we were talking about the challenge of standing up in front of your faculty to deliver news, and how we had to acknowledge how hurt, and sad, and worried, and everything everyone acknowledged we were. So we had to acknowledge that and accept how we were feeling without judgment. It was quickly, and we were talking about today, we went back to, oh, I shouldn't feel that way. I got to be tough. I got to be strong. And I was judging how I was feeling. So it was really important to acknowledge that I was sad, worried, overwhelmed, and that was okay to feel that way. So acknowledging my own emotions and accepting them without judgment, creating space for myself, and even if it was just a little space, like many of you identified, to pause, take a breath. When time allowed, I would journal. I journaled throughout that whole year after these crises, which helped me reflect and understand what the next steps were. As time went on, I needed to set, healthy boundaries and set healthy habits for myself around sleep and nutrition and getting up and moving my body. Um, and even in the most difficult, upsetting times, still finding ways to practice gratitude. And that was something that I learned was it was okay to be grateful. And it actually was helpful to practice gratitude in these most challenging times.
Can you say
But to answer your question, as far as practicing the gratitude, a lot of it. Oh, can you hear me, Robin?
I can? Yeah,
Okay,
and this is a
just my
good
my
example of
video
how
is spinning, but that's okay.
it's okay.
Finding certain things like during the crisis, I was so grateful to be in the school that was able to show support for each other and the students in these most difficult times, and be able to acknowledge that and say that was huge. And when I was able to acknowledge it, it was a light that made my heart feel good and helped me get through some of the difficult times.
And sharing that gratitude for the people around you, I'm sure, so help them to feel
Absolutely.
that moment. And what
Yeah.
about giving others the permission to feel? How did you do that during that
Well,
time?
a lot of it was modeling, sharing my own feelings, normalizing that this was difficult and challenging, um, letting them know I was feeling overwhelmed too. And then providing that emotional support, making sure I was checking in on the people that needed to be checked in on, identifying students and staff that were really close to the tragedy, and also identifying students that would need extra support, and validating for them that they need self-care as well, and giving themselves grace. Because again, we as educators, we give all day, and sometimes it's hard for us to support ourselves as well. And we'd say we have to take care of ourselves so we can take care of the kids.
Yes. And social support, that was your other go-to strategy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Tell
And
us.
so, well, it started with the crisis response team. We just had a really strong team that we could support each other on, but also reaching out to colleagues that had been through similar situations. When maybe I was doubting myself or didn't know where to go, talking to a colleague or uh, another mental health professional that could help me guide me through it and give me feedback. Oh, no, you know what? That is a really good approach. Or, you know what? Maybe you should try this. And then bringing in social support and counselors, not only for staff and students, but also for our admin team. And a few months post the immediate part of the crisis, we brought in a grief counselor for our admin team to work with individually. Because it really, what we didn't realize the toll leading through this crisis was taking on us as individuals, as school leaders. And having even that half hour once a week on campus where I could sit in my office with a counselor to really work through this was huge, and me helping myself to be able to then help others.
I think that's really important. And I just want to share also that in the chat room, Rachel Butler has said to everyone, shared openly and vulnerably about a story. Rachel and her school and school community lost a beloved nurse and gave themselves the permission to feel and others the permission to feel by sharing that there would be adults in the building who would be crying and sad and supporting each other as people do when social support is around, social support of people who are loving and caring. And one of the things that we want to remember at this time is that social support, while critical during a crisis, is also can be exhausting. The emotional load of teaching, as the title of our video, is true every single day. There is huge emotional load. And during a crisis in particular, you may feel like your job is all about giving and caretaking for others. And who's caretaking for you? So let's watch a video and see what they have to say, we have to say about
Research shows
emotional.
that when educators work in high stress environments, it can lead to physical and emotional health problems, interpersonal difficulties, and burnout. Building emotional awareness and the skills of emotional intelligence can mitigate those effects. Educators carry an extra emotional load when they try hard to display emotions that they don't actually feel. For example, a teacher may hear sad news about a loved one, but when she arrives at school, she feels she has to appear excited to her students. Sometimes a teacher has to show empathy when she's really feeling overwhelmed, or even be firm when she's really feeling warm and loving. It takes extra effort to create the appearance of having a feeling that we're not in fact having. This effort is called emotional labor. Without special care, too much emotional labor can cause stress and even lead to health problems. Of course, it's not useful to express every feeling we have whenever we have them, nor is the goal to always suppress our unpleasant feelings. Feelings matter because they're an important source of information about ourselves, others, and the world. What matters, though, is what we do with our emotions. That is, how we manage them and how we model regulation strategies for our students. If we don't use skills and strategies to regulate red and blue feelings wisely, it can lead to feelings of exhaustion, overwhelm, numbness, or burnout. This can be harmful to ourselves and can also harm our relationships. Educators who work in high-stress environments can suffer emotionally in other ways too. Take Ms. Blue, for example. At the beginning of the year, she was so energetic, so enthusiastic, generally empathic, and content. But many of her students are experiencing toxic stress. Ms. Blue's empathy for her students is one of her strengths as an educator, but too much empathy can lead, paradoxically, to compassion fatigue, where she becomes so emotionally worn out that she cannot be of help to herself, much less to the students that she cares for. Educators who care deeply about their students' difficulties sometimes experience moral distress. Moral distress is when you're just not able to take an action that you think would be right. For educators, this can happen when we understand our students' feelings, but we know that trying to change the source of their feelings, like poverty or homelessness or what happens at home, is just outside of our reach. It can also happen when teachers know that their students need more emotional support, but believe that they're just supposed to focus on academics. Sometimes educators also take on other people's stress. This is called secondary or vicarious traumatic stress. It's common among doctors, mental health professionals, and first responders, those who are repeatedly exposed to other people's suffering. How can we protect teachers' emotions and prevent burnout, moral distress, and compassion fatigue? What can we do to shift out of the red and the blue when we find ourselves in those emotional places more often than we like?
Was there something in particular that people resonated with? Just tell us in the chat.
Robin, for me, that resonates just with the ongoing fatigue and not even realizing it until I had time to sit down and really reflect on what was going on and what was, causing this fatigue I was feeling.
I think it's important to name it because
Yeah.
many people end up feeling exhausted and upset, don't realize that it's not just the crisis that's happened that's getting to them, but rather their own giving, constant giving, and as Stacy said, the many masks a person has to wear. Miriam, Miriam's going to take us through the rest of our trauma-informed resources.
Great. We have some questions about these resources, and so there's some links here for you guys to find this specific video that we shared, but also our collection of these trauma-informed ruler resources, in which we have many other videos as well, and some of the resources you can share with your faculty and staff and students during a time of crisis. But also going back to what we talked about of things you can do before a crisis to build those skills of self-awareness and also It's like, how do you have difficult conversations with emotional intelligence? So building these skills of self-awareness, regulation, thinking about that with your adults and your staff all the time, not just in a crisis situation. So how are we having conversations between the adults? How can we think about that with intention, and how do we have like impact between ourselves? So thinking about like the before. So when we're in these situations, we can lean on our skills. And then by extension, with our students. So how do students build their skills? How do we have difficult conversations with emotional intelligence? How do we walk them through, thinking about difficult times? How do they have these conversations? How can they ask these questions? How can we create spaces for them? So these are some of the resources that you can find on Ruler Online, in addition to like the charter and the mood meter and building those skills through the tools, but also more targeted resources aligning with what we were speaking about today. We also have other videos. We have 5 steps to help children regulate their emotions. And these are just some things that your teachers can implement in their classroom just to build these skills in our students and our faculty and our staff, to be thinking about skills that we can lean on during all the times. Because sometimes we think about a crisis as a big one-off situation, but our students and our teachers have all kinds of crises in their lives that you may not even be aware of as an educator. So thinking about giving them the skills and giving ourselves the skills we need to deal with this. And I'm going through this quickly because we did say we want to save the time at the end, but just thinking about integrating some of these resources into your daily practice to help people have them when they need them. And I'm not going to play the video, I'm sorry, but turn this back over to Fran, and then
Yeah.
we're going to go to the questions that we have.
Thanks, Miriam. And yeah, such an important point about, opportunities to apply these skills and use these skills for students and staff, because like you said, everyone has their own situations going on where these skills can be helpful as well. And a quick point on the emotional mask idea and the different masks we wear, the importance of granting yourself permission to feel and then relying or enacting some strategies so you can feel and still be effective as a leader in the day-to-day and during a crisis as well. So looking at our, takeaways from the time together, understanding that these emotional intelligence practices will support workplace well-being for your adults, for your students, and for your whole school community. And not just in the time of crisis, but the proactive work during the crisis and after. It's important, we touch base on, the proactive planning from your work on teaching and practicing the emotional intelligence skills, to preparing a crisis response team, regularly meeting with that crisis response team in preparation, and then enacting that team when there is a crisis. Thinking really clearly during the crisis about, focusing on what is the most important thing in the moment. Number one is that emotional regulation support to help others make these good decisions, and then to support others through the process. And then after the crisis, what types of follow-ups and supports will continue to be needed is so important. Being aware of how compassion fatigue can be impacting you as a school leader, and then, preparation can really help you focus on what matters most during those crises and taking it one step at a time. And I just, leaning on that social support to reflect. It was multiple times a day, then a daily reflection process with my key colleagues and friends to make sure I was prepared for the next day.
Thank you for that, Fran. I'll add to that simply that everyone takes a different amount of time to get past the crisis or to move on with the
Mhm.
crisis inside
Yeah.
of that, moving forward. And
And absolutely, and that was a big conversations we'd have with staff and students as well, is everyone's gonna respond and react at different times in different ways, and it's all based on their own lived experiences, right? So that's where sometimes the blueprint would come into action throughout down the line when maybe someone said or did something that really hurt someone else, and being able to understand their perspectives in that to restore harm that's caused during a crisis as well.
Yes. And there's no right or wrong.
No.
It's up to the individual to let you know how he or she or they are doing.
Okay, so I want to thank everyone who submitted questions as you're registering. I'm going to call a few out and also invite you to use the chat or the Q&A to let us know if you have any other questions we can answer now. The first one I'm going to offer up is how to keep faculty morale while word of a crisis spreads. How do you keep up faculty morale while word of a crisis spreads? Fran?
Well, I guess I'm interpreting that question. It kind of sounds like different word, I would say, of the crisis. Everyone might have a different interpretation of that can really impact in a negative way the morale if the communication isn't clear. I like to explain, like, if you don't tell the story as the leader, other people are going to tell the story in the way they think it happened. So that's when you have to, use those resources of having those really difficult conversations and being clear and transparent about situations, and then being, especially with your staff, really clear and transparent with, this isn't, our story to tell. Really talking about and the perspectives of other people involved in the situation. So I think communication is key in that. And if you catch wind or a staff member comes to you and worried about maybe a rumor or something that's being said, get everyone together. Let's talk about it. What's the worry? Because it's everyone's intentions are usually good. It's good, right? And they may just be talking about it because they need to talk about it. So let's offer a safe space and a productive space where we can have those conversations.
I think that's so helpful, Fran, and I'll add to that we have found that and even when you and I have talked about this in the past, a dose of radical reality, a radical acceptance is also really important because, we even had a comment about the pressure earlier today. A lot of people feel pressured to fix things that cannot be fixed. And so evaluating for yourself as a school community or as for individuals, teachers and leaders, can you take away students' pain? Can you promise that it'll never happen again? No, you can't. But what can you do? And there is a lot you can do in daily practice, skillfully, in social support, in giving yourself permission to feel.
Yeah.
So just being mindful of that question. Is there something I can do about it? Here's what it is. Can I make it all better? No, I can't.
Yeah, and Robin, some of the most challenging things that I faced post-crisis was that, like, you can't fix it. You can't, the worry that parents have when they see something happen to someone else's child. And then having to say no, because everyone's intentions are good. They'll come to you with an idea of how they want to honor or memorialize, and certain things just aren't appropriate. And having to, in a kind and empathetic way, say that to people is a challenge.
This actually goes very well with our next question, which is how do you lead with emotional intelligence when you have groups of students or parents who disagree with one another?
Well, I think number one is acknowledging that they don't agree. And they may not agree, you may not agree with them too, but so acknowledging that this is their belief or their thought based on what they believe would be best. And maybe it's best for them, but not overall. And then having that conversation and finding some common ground. I know we don't agree on this, but we can all agree that we're sad and we want to find a way to memorialize this child in a way that's appropriate for the school community. I'm just using that as an example because I know that came up a lot when dealing with loss of students.
And so changing the goal from having to have agreement to finding common ground. I like that a lot.
Yeah.
And it's not easy. It's not easy for people, even those of us who are very skilled, to let go of wanting to perhaps convince the other side, or get your way, and it's not the goal.
And I think another thing too, Miriam, acknowledge you may not know the answer, and let's bring in some professional help to help us with this, right? And that's oftentimes helped us in certain situations, to bring someone who's outside of the community, that's a professional in this realm, and can help us, figure out the right thing to do.
Fran, we have a question actually that goes along with that was just submitted. Who are the
Mhm.
key stakeholders that were included on your crisis response team? So like,
All right.
did you bring in other people? Were they in-house? Who are
Yeah,
they?
so our crisis response team was in-house. It was superintendent, principals, other administrators, school counselors. I'm grateful to say we had a social worker and a school psychologist in our school, so they were part of the crisis response team as well. And then given what the crisis was, we would then include, so for example, if it was a crisis that happened in our alternative school, which was a smaller group run by a smaller amount of staff, we'd make sure the director of that school was part of the group as well.
We have another question about, if you're a new ruler school and you've had a recent trauma, would it be too soon to introduce the skills and tools?
I don't think so. No.
What do you think you might do if you can put on that hat for a moment, Fran, in your school?
In that moment, so if we're a new ruler school, I would again focus on the adults, the adult work, because the adults are going to be the ones that are with the children all day. So I think if all of a sudden you went into the classrooms and were, teaching these skills to the kids right away after a trauma happened to the community, it may be a little bit taken the wrong way. But if you're working with the adults on how to develop their skills to then help support students, that would be an effective way to start.
Yeah. I certainly agree with that. I think that the goal is to help people who are in charge of the children be emotionally intelligent and skillful themselves, and being aware of themselves and regulating their own emotions, so that then they can be those models and work with children. And they can, at that point, select if there is a tool, for instance, that they might want to use. And I would say it depends, every situation would be different. Every cast of characters is going to be different. And what one community can absorb quickly and one set of adults can absorb quickly may be different than someone
And it's
else.
important too, and you're not doing the emotional intelligence work, the ruler work with the adults, so then the adults can then be counselors in their classrooms. It's so they can have these skills for themselves. And I don't think you can say that enough or clearly enough. This is the work for you as the adult. That's so you can use your skills to then be present, to teach, to be there, to be supportive.
All right, we have time for one last question, and it's a big one, so let's see what we can do. Any suggestions on how to how to address rumors when a family has not given permission to share? This happens a lot with students who have cell phones and social media, which we cannot monitor as easily as we can chatter around the school. For example, students may have heard that a death was a suicide, but we have not been given permission to share by the family, so we cannot confirm or deny, and the ambiguity is hard.
Yeah, that is that's hard. I think my advice in that situation is the language you use, out of respect for the family, at this time. This is what we're able to share. And then what you have to lean on is there a person connected from the school with that family to work with that family and help them determine what would be the best way to communicate. But again, it's just continuing. And then I would say with your staff, being clear with your staff, like, hey, I know there's rumors going around that this was the cause of death. At this time, that's not confirmed. But here's what we do know. And here's what the plan is to help support our students.
So what happens, I'm just going to push on this a little because I've had this
Mhm.
situation several times through the years where the parents did not want the school to say it was a suicide, but because of the community this person was in, it was confirmed that it was a suicide. So there
Mhm.
was confirmation, and yet the teachers were acting like they didn't know that it was confirmed. This was not a ruler school. It was before I even got to the center that I'm thinking about. But that can be a little crazy making for a lot of people, and yet you're absolutely right. You have to respect the parents' wishes.
Yeah, and ultimately, depending on how big of a situation it gets, you have to understand your obligations and legal requirements, and that's where you would include your, attorneys that your school and school district have to make sure that you're communicating in the correct way.
Yeah, and talking to the parents about the fact that, for example, in that situation, that the students do have other sources of information, and they
Yeah.
are walking around, and perhaps knowing the truth would be helpful, but at the end, it's up to the family what they want to do.
And considering too the rest of that family too, because you have to consider, are there younger siblings? Are there other siblings in the district that you're going to be working with this family for 6, 7, 8 more years? So it's more of a long of like, how can we work with this family and eventually maybe get to a different spot? But right now we have to know that they're still one of us. They're still part of our school community.
We would love to be able to answer all the questions that were submitted, but we do invite you to schedule a coaching session with us. And you can do that through Ruler Online or using this QR code where we can happily walk you through the trauma-informed resources, any of the other Ruler resources, help you plan how you can put together a plan for your district or school. So that could be a next step for you. We want to thank you for joining us. These are some other ways you can stay connected to us. And we will be sending out this recording and all the resources that we covered today. And just thank you to everyone for being here today.